Just wanted to give you a just sort of a flavor and feel for what the Army in the Pacific Asia theater was like at that point, the kind of missions it was embarking on, the challenges it faced, and also some of the leadership too. Um, so, if we could go to the next slide, Kathleen's nice enough to manipulate my slides, and yeah, that's the book this is based on, and the next one after that, you'll see here in in the next one, the expanse of the map that shows you the operational environment. That is what you're looking at there. That's about a third of the world's surface of ocean and continent and island. And that's where the Army's operating in this war against Japan, especially by 1945. By that point, you've got Army garrisons and units of varying sizes stretching from from the tip of the Aleutians and Alaska to the South Pacific, where you see New Guinea, and of course, who knows how many dozens of smaller islands. The Philippines, the Asian continent, most notably in northern Burma, also China. So many points between. You've got about 1.4 million soldiers who are spread across that enormous expanse of the Earth's surface. So by this point, the U.S. Army had really matured into the one that I would argue one of the most potent, sophisticated land forces in human history. And of course, major battles still loomed ahead as 1945 began. In the course of the war, more than 1.8 million Army ground soldiers would serve in the war against Japan. Now, to give you a little larger perspective in American history, that's the third largest military force this country has ever sent overseas to fight a war. The third largest, behind only the European theater in World Wars I and II. So, I mean, it's just a really vast force with all kinds of diversity, all kinds of different people, and an enormous number of missions and skill sets. And as by that point, certainly the most amphibious experienced ground force in human history by 1945. It comprised at that point, ultimately, about 21 infantry and airborne divisions. Yes, there were airborne units in the Pacific. They tend to get overshadowed by the more famous units in Europe. Plus, there were assorted independent, regimental combat teams, tank battalions, engineer special brigades, and the like that really, I would argue, comprised another, 3 to 4 to 5 divisions worth of combat manpower. And those numbers I've given you, by the way, do not include the Army Air Forces, which I'm sure you know that the Air Force was part of the Army during World War II. It gets its independence after the war. So in those numbers I gave you, I'm not even including the Army Air Forces. And yet, the size of the Army and theater absolutely dwarfs the size of the Marine Corps and theater. The Marine Corps mobilized 6 combat divisions. That was the largest the Marine Corps had ever been. And obviously, the Marines are going to do a heck of a lot of fighting in the war against Japan. But what I noticed, and what attracted me to this topic, is that it seemed to me that in our popular memory of the war against Japan, there's a sense that it was mainly the Navy's war. And then whatever ground fighting had to be done was done by the Marines. And, that was basically the war against Japan. Now, of course, one glance at the map shows you, that obviously the maritime nature of the theater, there's no question of that, obviously, and the incredible importance of sea power. I would never argue otherwise. What I'm saying, and I guess the larger kind of theme and focus of the series is that, contrary to our popular memory, the vast majority of the ground fighting and all the other missions that were sort of emblematic of ground operations in World War II in the Pacific Asia, the vast majority of it was done by the Army. In the course of the war, the Marine Corps carried out 15 amphibious operations, amphibious invasions. Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger's 8th Army alone carried out 35 in the spring of 1945 in the Philippines. And overall, the Army was in low 3 figures in terms of the number of amphibious invasions in World War II in the Pacific. So my purpose in pointing this out, I should also hasten to add, is not to denigrate the Marine Corps. It's actually the opposite, because when you get a sense of that kind of larger context, I think you really begin to grasp, it really hits home, I think, how the Marines were punching above their weight. And of course, the valor of the Marines, we all know, absolutely off the charts. And of course, there's no question there are iconic Marine battles and so on and so forth. But by design, their role was supposed to be complementary to the larger role of the Army. And there are very, very, very few exclusively Marine battles, really, in the history of the Corps, but also in World War II. There's Tarawa, Cape Gloucester, maybe Iwo Jima, although the Army's involved there on a smaller level too. Most of the time, where the Marines are fighting, they're fighting alongside the Army. And of course, much of the time in the war against Japan, the Army is fighting on its own without a Marine ground presence too. So my hope in publishing the series was to kind of expand our view and to get a sense of what land power really meant in the war against Japan and the incredible responsibility that the Army took on. If we could go to the next slide, it gives you a sense of the face of these guys. These are just typical Army soldiers in one invasion somewhere in the Pacific. And I would point out that the plurality of the American deaths in the war against Japan were guys like these, Army ground soldiers. About 42,000 of them did not survive, felled by combat, disease, accidents, the terrible privation of captivity. The majority of American POWs in the custody of the Japanese during World War II were from the U.S. Army ground forces. So you have a harvest of death that, again, to give you a sort of another perspective, it totaled more than the entirety of any previous American conflict, except, of course, the Civil War and World War I. So again, I'll repeat, the Army alone in the war against Japan lost more dead than America had suffered in any of its wars up to that time, except for the Civil War and World War I. So the Army at this point, by 1945, is just staggeringly complex. It's got vast capabilities seldom seen in the course of human events. And it really, by then, had proven itself very adept at performing a variety of really challenging missions. There's grand strategical planning, of course, which underpins this entire war. Much of it inter-service. I mean, the Army's going nowhere without the Navy, of course, and in a way, vice versa too, because the Navy can't really control ground, and in the end, that's what this war comes down to. I would argue most wars do. And so they have to work together very well. There's a lot of grand strategical planning, and of course, political planning. There's combined operations with allies, the British, the Australians, the New Zealanders, locals from various Pacific islands, including coast watchers, the Chinese. Of course, that is a very important alliance and an ill-fated one at that. So you have that. You've got diplomacy, these joint operations with allies, logistics. I mean, the logistics of this war are absolutely staggering, and the Army really is handling so much of that. And in relation to transportation, of course, ground transportation is obvious. What that means: trucking and moving stuff forward through all sorts of different vehicles and conveyances, including even like mules in the Burma campaign would be one example I'd give you, but mostly by vehicles, but also water transportation. During World War II in the Pacific, the Army has its own Navy. The Navy is so overstretched with responsibility that it's okay with the Army running its own ships in order to move its own supplies and whatnot. So you see some of that too. Engineering. This is an engineering problem on so many levels. The building of ports, the building of depots, the building of little mini American cities all over the Pacific, the building of airfields, which of course is crucial. The projection of air power is such a big part of this war and how it's won. Army aviation engineers are a big part of doing that. So, of course, the traditional combat engineer missions too, of dealing with fortifications and mines and booby traps and setting mines, and in many cases they're going to be working with flames and flamethrowers and so on and so forth. So intel gathering, which we always have. Obviously, the Army's heavily involved in that. Guerrilla warfare, especially in the Philippines, you see a major element of that. Medical care on a scale unimaginable even a generation earlier. The Army's medical responsibilities would absolutely stagger the mind. And of course, medical knowledge had evolved a great deal even since World War I. Probably saves a lot of lives. Civil affairs. We tend to think of the Pacific War as having empty battlefields, and every now and again that's true, but usually it's not. So you're dealing with locals and humanitarian operations and counterintelligence, all this kind of stuff that the Army is doing. And of course, oh, by the way, ground combat operations of nearly every type and description, including armor. We tend to associate armor just with the war in Europe. No, there's a lot of tanks employed in the war against Japan. And of course, it's a war fought in some of the world's most inhospitable locales against a foe who recognized really few Western style rules of warfare. The Japanese were not signatories to the 1929 Geneva Convention. The Americans were. And of course, the Americans are kind of plunged into an elemental death struggle, whose nature I would think really that too few Americans at the time grasped. And I don't know that we have really grasped it all that well ever since. And so the Americans really have to come to terms with how they are going to fight against an enemy that really gives no quarter and asks no quarter, that will deliberately shoot medics, that will play dead and then try and kill you, and rarely ever surrender. Any kind of thing that they're willing to do in terms of brutalization. The Americans have to come to terms with how they're going to fight the war. And so I would really say that we have more lessons to learn from the war against Japan in relation to wars ever since than we do the war against Germany, because pretty much all of our opponents ever since have fought with few rules of war as Americans would think of it. And so the Americans then have to come face to face with their own moral dilemmas too, of how they will fight and survive. And so, you are seeing this war against Japan. It's really Army soldiers as much as anybody who are confronted with that, because honestly, ground combat is the most ferocious of all combat and often the costliest. So where it's fought is a little bit of a harbinger too. With the exception of Grenada, Panama, and Mogadishu, pretty much every American war since World War II has been fought somewhere on the Asian landmass. And so the war against Japan gives us that kind of indicator of the future. And ground fighting has, by the way, since World War II, accounted for about 90% of American war deaths, most by Army soldiers, all at a time when ground combat was supposed to become obsolete, as you see these massive leaps, of course, in nuclear technology, sea power, air power, cyber, space age, all of this kind of stuff was supposed to make ground fighting obsolete. But the reality has been quite otherwise. And so we tend to think of the Pacific Asia War as an air war and a naval war, and it was, but it's also a ground war, and really at a larger level, and especially in terms of the cost. So I don't propose to walk you through all of the Army's experiences in 1945 in the war against Japan. For that, obviously, you have to read my incredible book and and buy it, right? So that's always my terrible, nefarious agenda. But instead, tonight, I just want to give you a kind of a sense of the Army in 1945, but looking maybe at some of the key personalities and the battles that they're managing, especially in the Philippines, which honestly is the nexus of the American war against Japan. We fight two major campaigns there, and it really animates, of course, much of what one of the key commanders in theater, where he wants to fight and what he thinks is most important. If we go to the next slide, we see this guy. We all know him very well, General Douglas MacArthur. You see him here as a 5-star. He had been promoted to 5-star general in December 1944, so that dates this picture. Then looking at this picture, it has to be, after that time. And of course, by 1945, he's on the cusp of liberating his beloved Luzon, the largest and most politically powerful island in the Philippines. And of course, it's where the capital of Manila is, and it's where, honestly, MacArthur would have thought of as his home. He had spent a lot of time there over the years. His family had deep ties with the Filipino people, including his father, of course, who had commanded American military forces in the Philippines in the early 20th century. The MacArthurs, and Douglas in particular, loved the people of the archipelago, a nascent, about to be independent nation state with about 7,000 islands of incredible diversity. So he himself is complex to the point of convolution. A close aide once said of him, "None of us really knew MacArthur. We all saw fragments of the man." I think there was a lot of truth to that. He was remarkably courageous. He was epically conniving. He believed with an almost evangelical intensity that America's future lay in the Pacific and Asia. And when we look at back in this 80 plus years later, I don't know that he was wrong about that. I think that a great bit of America's future did lay in the region and still does, you know. So didn't mean Europe wasn't important and continues as such, but I think he understood maybe as well or better than anybody just how front and center Asia and the Pacific would be in future American events. So Lieutenant Colonel Dusty Rhodes was his pilot. And so he spent as much time with MacArthur as anybody, especially in this last phase of the war. And he had a really interesting comment, I think, that gives us a little insight into this guy. He said about MacArthur, he had some feeling that he was a man of destiny. He seemed to believe that he was especially protected so that he could fulfill a mission. What was that mission? Well, of course, the liberation of the Philippines, which he saw as a modern crusade. And honestly, crusade would be almost too small of a word for how he saw this. So MacArthur, one thing that, of course, one among many things that makes him unique is that he had once been the Army's chief of staff. He'd been in the number one position in the mid 1930s. And so he'd had, you know, a really high trajectory career as a younger officer. You know, he's promoted to brigadier general at age 39. He's a, you know, Army chief of staff by age, you know, whatever, 49, 50, something like that. And so, you know, it's like the problem with that is once retirement hits, you're still pretty young. So what do you do next? So famously, of course, what he had done, he had gone to the Philippines in the late 1930s to build the armed forces of the archipelago because the American government had planned to give the Philippines its independence by 1946. And of course, in the meantime, the war with Japan looms and the Japanese invade the archipelago and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so as I'm sure you know, MacArthur deals with that whole challenge of building up this really quite nascent military force in the late 1930s, which is really quite which is unique in American military history. It's a Phil-American force in 1941 and 42, in which the vast majority of the manpower, about 75 to 80%, were Filipinos and the rest Americans. So kind of a British colonial style army that the Americans and MacArthur had built. And of course, famously, President Roosevelt orders him out. He and many of his staffers leave the Philippines, and he says, I shall return. And of course, to him, that is a matter of honor. And so he'd been arguing for years, you know, to come back to the Philippines and liberate the 17 to 18 million people of this country, which he saw as American soil. Okay, so MacArthur is reaching the kind of capstone operations of that by 1945. And so there's a different dynamic in play for him as a theater commander than any other theater commander for the Americans around the globe, because he had once been the number one guy in the Army, and here he is as a theater commander. So he has a lot of age, a lot of seniority, and a lot of political clout that he has built up through a kind of a cult of personality back home. So he's got two key players in carrying out his vision of liberating the Philippines. If we could go to the next slide, you can see one of them here. Okay, the guy on the left is Lieutenant General Walter Kruger, who commands 6th Army, which will become the largest American ground combat formation in the war against Japan. The guy on the right, by the way, is Vice Admiral Tommy Kincaid, with whom MacArthur is going to work very closely during this last stage of World War II, and had consummated a very productive relationship. To MacArthur's credit, though he was quite disillusioned with the Navy in the first campaign in the Philippines, he will forge some good productive relationships with his naval colleagues, most notably William Bull Halsey, of course, earlier in the war. Eventually, Tommy Kincaid and another one called Rear Admiral Daniel Barbet, who will be really a leading authority on amphibious operations. So here is General Kruger standing there with Kincaid. Who is Kruger? How does he come into play here? Just a fascinating background for this guy. He is like the ultimate self-made soldier. Kruger actually was born in Germany. His father was an officer in the German army. And when Kruger was an adolescent, his father died. So Kruger is a year younger than MacArthur. MacArthur's born in 1880. Kruger's born in 1881. And so as an adolescent, now Kruger's mother takes him to immigrate to the United States. So he comes actually, they initially settled in St. Louis, where I'm from, where you have a large German American community. And so he has to adapt to a completely new country, a new culture, a new language. Kruger prided himself on the fact that he spoke English with hardly a trace of a German accent once he became an adult. He was multilingual. Obviously, he spoke German, but he also spoke Spanish and French as well. It gave you a sense into his really quite rich intellectual capability. So in 1898, when war broke out with Spain, Kruger wanted to be part of it. And so at age 17, he joins the army as a private. So here he is, a private soldier in the initial stage of his career. He retires about a half century later as a 4-star general. It's really an amazing kind of thing. And also the other thing, and this will never happen again, I'm confident to say, the educational level. Many, of course, Kruger's general officer colleagues were West Pointers, and they had the West Point pedigree, right? Of course, many others, almost all others, all of them really that I know of, had a college degree. Kruger had no West Point pedigree. He had no college degree, and he also had no high school diploma. So that's why I say that's not going to happen again, that you'd have a general without a high school diploma. So he's very much self-taught. He's an autodidact, and yet he can really hold his own with his peers in terms of like wonky military intellectual papers that he publishes in the 1920s. He's a totally dedicated soldier. Self-made guy, had gone all through the NCO ranks, commissioned from the ranks when he's serving in the Philippines, by the way. So personally, he's a wonderful husband to his wife, Grace, good father to his 3 kids. Professionally, he has a reputation as a really kind of a brusque guy, very cold and brusque and rude at times, and there's a lot of truth to that. So as Kruger ascended the ranks, he's very much a no-nonsense kind of person. Some interesting perceptions of him as cautious, exacting, brusque, upright. He has a deep affinity for the average soldier because he was one once, and so he understood what it was like. One of his this is somebody who served as his chief of staff before Kruger deployed overseas. So this was a stateside army level post that he commanded in 1941. Said few generals were physically tougher or more active. Relentlessly driving himself, he had little need of driving others. They were quick to follow his example. That was Dwight Eisenhower, who once served as Kruger's chief of staff. One of Kruger's other commanders assessed he was a good soldier and a good strategist and a very sound thinker, but he didn't have much of a personality. And that's 100%. His human side could come out at times, especially with enlisted soldiers. You know, he had very sharp elbows with his officer colleagues. Short, rude, brusque, kind of obtuse at times. Operationally, he is very methodical. He's very sensible. He's a set piece kind of guy, and he's often thought of as cautious with good reason. So at Luzon, his 6th Army led the invasion and is going to dominate the campaign that follows. In the next slide, you'll see MacArthur's other key guy, Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger, who I mentioned briefly a few moments ago. Eichelberger comes from a very different background. It's interesting because personality-wise, he's of course quite different than Kruger, but in terms of ethics, they're very similar. And in terms of their dedication to the army and their soldiers, they're to a T so alike. Eichelberger is born in Ohio in an upper middle class background. His father was a well-to-do lawyer in Urbana, Ohio, and a U.S. veteran from the Civil War. And so Eichelberger is the youngest of 5 children, who has this idyllic boyhood, pretty well off, but his father's a lawyer and a gentleman farmer. And, he has this sort of wonderful growing up period. But, Eichelberger's father, like some prosperous parents, felt that his kids would be soft and they wouldn't be ready for the world, and he had to kind of test them. So the Eichelberger family was kind of like a reality show. Of the father constantly testing the kids to a point of obnoxiousness. So if you're the youngest and you have 3 older brothers and an older sister, you're not going to come out well. And so no one took Bob very seriously. They loved him because he was, He was witty, he was charming, he was warm, he was fun, he had a great sense of humor. He was adventurous, and he just devoured any book about the Civil War in his father's library, and he'd sit there and listen when his father had Civil War veterans, come over. And his mother, by the way, had experienced the war on the southern side. I think she was from the Vicksburg area, so very interesting dynamic there. So Bob just was beloved, but not taken very seriously. So soldiering becomes his way to achieve and to show that he's as good as anybody else. He goes to West Point. He graduates in the class of 1909 as an infantry officer. He too will be a really good husband, a soulmate to his wife Emma. They had no children. Eichelberger during World War One had not served on the Western Front. He'd gone to Russia in the Polar Bear expedition, and he'd gone as an intel officer and key guy for General Graves, who commanded the expedition for the U.S. So Eichelberger saw combat. He is, as I said, an intel officer. He's a kind of jack of all trades. At one point, he was embedded with a Japanese Army unit because the Japanese are part of this too. Eichelberger gets a Distinguished Service Cross. He's a really interesting career there. And Eichelberger being Eichelberger, he studies the Japanese, he studies the situation. By World War II, of course, he's a general, and he is one of the most beloved guys in the Army because he's got friends everywhere because of his warm, affectionate personality. How is he similar to Kruger? They're both really honest people, and they're both totally dedicated to their soldiers. Interesting observations about Eichelberger. One of his close friends described him as one of the most colorful and attractive individuals it has been my good fortune to meet. General Eichelberger had a rare way with people. He enjoyed people, all kinds of people. Because of his lively curiosity, vitality, and basic optimism, he never became an old man. And above all, he was honest. So they, though, had developed a major rivalry by 1945. Eichelberger had served under Kruger earlier in the war, and he felt that Kruger had been incredibly rude to him and inconsiderate and had not treated him well. And Eichelberger, for all of his great qualities, could be very sensitive to slights and could nurse resentments. And he had one thing he had very similar to one of his West Point classmates, a guy named George Patton. I'm sure you've heard of him. Eichelberger wanted fame and posterity. He yearned for that, and he was a totally lead from the front, aggressive kind of combat commander. Incredibly brave, very similar to Patton. He's like Patton without all the personal drama and the slapping incidents and all that. But interestingly, they kept in touch during the war. They were friends, and they wrote to each other, and they learned a lot from each other. So Eichelberger felt Kruger was too brusque, rude, and cautious and methodical. Kruger felt that Eichelberger was too forgiving and solicitous, a failure with subordinates, especially his staff and whatever, and wasn't ruthless enough. So MacArthur knows about their rivalry and is going to play one off against the other for his larger agenda of liberating the Philippines. So in the next slide, you can see what's called S-Day by MacArthur's headquarters, the invasion of Luzon, January 9th, 1945. Look at how massive that invasion is. It's a 4-division invasion, all Army divisions. You can even see all the follow-on forces there, that are absolutely enormous. And think of all the shipping that takes in order to move that much, move those number of troops, all the stuff, the equipment, the weaponry, all that kind of stuff that goes with them. It's an incredible achievement of naval power as well. But the 4 divisions that go ashore, technically, that's more than we had sent ashore. We as Americans, I'm saying, had sent ashore on D-Day at Normandy. Okay, so it gives you a sense of the scale of this thing. MacArthur had once complained about, the paucity of resources given to his theater, which was called the Southwest Pacific Area, or SWAPA. He'd once complained about that and said it was backbench, and he, really kvetched about it a lot. But really, that was quite silly, honestly, in the long run, because he has now the amount of combat power he's got by 1945 is second only to what Eisenhower has in Europe. So it's enormous. You've got the Japanese defenders under General Yamashita there. His name you see right in the central part of our Luzon. Comes to about 287,000 soldiers, roughly. And so he knows that the Americans are going to get ashore, that they basically, after the U.S. Navy's victory at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, that the Americans really control the waters for the most part, and they generally control the air. So what he thinks he must do, and he's correct, is to basically just hunker down and use a lot of the good terrain you've got in Luzon to basically just bleed the Americans. And this larger strategic purpose of this is the hope that Japan will be able to negotiate some sort of end to the war, short of unconditional surrender, to preserve its empire, to preserve its emperor, maybe to preserve its situation in China, whatever it might be. Bleeding the Americans, breaking their will to see the war through to its end, is the objective, and it's not a far-fetched one. It is a possible thing. It is not a probable thing, but it could happen. So Sixth Army gets ashore fairly easily because Yamashita is not defending at the waterline. He's defending inland to bleed them. But even getting ashore, now you face an enormous task of unloading freight, moving supplies, developing airfields, reconstructing roads. There's 11,000 short tons of supplies and ammo that are moving across the beaches every day. It's a major job to develop the depots, the rail lines, and that part of Luzon, which have been destroyed. The Americans are hiring Filipino labor to help them with this. That's absolutely crucial, and that is another thing I wanted to point out. The crucial role of the Filipinos in their own liberation. They are absolutely front and center, not just on the labor side and on supporting the Americans, which they largely do, but also Filipino guerrillas that are a major, major element of the military operations in most of the islands, but especially Luzon. So they're going to be what we now call a force multiplier on a really a huge level and a serious headache for the Japanese. So from the start, from really the start of MacArthur's operation in the Philippines the previous fall, you've seen the Filipino guerrillas in this thing as major players. So if we go on to the next one, all right, so it shows you exactly the kind of direction of operations. MacArthur wants two key objectives in the aftermath of the successful invasion in January. He wants, you may have heard of Clark Air Force Base, what was called Clark Field in those days, a network of airfields northwest of Manila that you have to have for obvious reasons. Your close air support, your resupply, supporting Nimitz's operations, Admiral Nimitz farther to the east, a lot of different stuff, but you, of course, want to have that. And then Manila itself. Okay, so the idea is here, I Corps, nowadays we call it First Corps, but it's the Roman numeral that looks like I. In those days, they called themselves I Corps. Focus on holding that northern flank. The concern is Yamashita could counterattack. He doesn't to a great level. He understands he needs to just kind of hunker down and defend, and that's how he can bleed the Americans the best. But I Corps will hold that northern flank, while Major General Oscar Griswold's 14th Corps is going to fight its way to Clark Field and Manila, basically a southerly advance in the aftermath. Okay, so Griswold, by the way, is a really good commander. I think it's a shame he's really been overlooked quite a bit too. But he will advance the best he can, but Kruger is not driving the operations very hard. And to be fair, 6th Army / 14th Corps, whatever you want to think of it as, is dealing with a lot of bridge outages. There are 217 wrecked timber bridges between the beaches and Manila. So there again, that's an engineering issue, isn't it? Of having to rehab and refurbish and rebuild those bridges for vehicles, not always for infantry, but certainly for vehicles. But also, too, Kruger is just not a driver. He's a careful, sensible tactician. He's not really inclined to take major risks. He's worried about the Japanese counterattacking against him from the east and his flanks and all that. And that's not necessarily, outrageous to worry about that. But I would point out, too, if the Japanese are going to think along those lines, they're really going to make themselves vulnerable to getting hit back by American air power, American armor, American, the strength of American firepower when the Japanese are attacking us, which we've seen that pattern in this war, that generally doesn't work out well for the Japanese. So Kruger is just not really inclined to take that risk. And MacArthur gets very frustrated with him as we get into the latter part of January now, because MacArthur wants Manila as quickly as he could possibly get it. You'll hear sometimes in our sort of popular memory of this, the unfair charge that MacArthur wanted Manila for his own vanity and to have it by his birthday on January 26th. I found no evidence of that, literally none. It's, I think, very unfair. MacArthur had plenty of vanity, to be sure, but not really about this. He wanted Manila for very good, tangible reasons, not just the symbolism, but the logistics. When you think of the size and the scale of his forces that you just saw on our map, think of what it takes to support that. And you need a major harbor for that. And Manila, of course, is that. So MacArthur's very frustrated with Kruger. At one point, he even locates his headquarters ahead of Sixth Army to try and shame him into moving quicker. Doesn't work. Sixth Army is moving maybe about 2 to 3 miles a day or so. Now, I would say, just as a smarty pants historian, and of course we have all the answers, don't we? It's so easy for us all these years later to know this. But I would say, if MacArthur wants to blame anybody for this frustration, he should blame himself, because he has miscast his key commanders. If you want that quick drive for Manila, Eichelberger's your guy, not Kruger. He's chosen the wrong guy for this particular mission. And so he has a sense of this even before the invasion, but especially after. And so he decides, as the map shows you, if you look in the bottom part of the map, he decides he's going to unleash Eichelberger in a kind of one division assault to the south to try and pincers the Japanese in Manila, as Griswold's 14th Corps, led by the 1st Cavalry Division and the 37th Infantry Division, two terrific units, are moving in on Manila from the north, and also Clark Field. He is going to unleash Eichelberger in control of the 11th Airborne Division, a superbly trained unit that had fought very well at Leyte in the fall, to come at Manila from the south. Okay, and he offers Eichelberger this kind of immortality. He tells him, Bob, you could be the Patton of the Pacific. And of course, that's going to resonate with Eichelberger, as you might imagine. So Eichelberger leads this amphibious invasion on January 31st at a place called Nasugbu. And then eventually, as the map shows you, there's even going to be an airborne landing of the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment at Tagaytay Ridge, and then this kind of leftward turn to go up towards Manila. Now, that's about a 65, 70-mile advance, and it's just amazingly well done. They outfight, they outwit, they outthink the Japanese at pretty much every turn. But remember, it's only one lightly armed airborne division. There's only so much they can do. So, yes, they are advancing, but it's in this narrow corridor. They joke that their supply line is like, 20 yards wide, that kind of thing. They're aided by guerrillas, but they really do an amazing job of advancing on Manila from the south until they hit what's called the Ganko line. Interestingly, the Japanese had expected the main American advance to come from the south. So their most powerful fortifications to defend Manila were in the southerly approaches to the city at the Ganko line. And the 11th Airborne, being a lightly armed airborne division without as much artillery as a standard infantry division, that kind of stuff, is not going to be well equipped to deal with that on its own. So 11th Airborne gets into the southern part of Manila, but the main American advance will come from the north, 1st Cavalry Division, 37th Infantry Division, under Kruger's operational control, under 6th Army's operational control. So the next thing, too, what the Japanese are doing in response. Yamashita will claim after the war that he had never intended to defend Manila. And we have to take him at his word, but I still think that's remarkable for a commander of his intelligence to not plan on defending a major metropolitan area, because if your objective is to bleed your enemy for some larger strategic purpose, it's hard to imagine any better way to do that than in urban combat, where you don't even have to be that good or that well trained. The urban maw does it for you, and of course, for attackers, urban combat is incredibly manpower intensive and bloody and costly, and usually in time as well. So nonetheless, he will claim that, but he is not really in control of the Japanese garrison at Manila. There's some Imperial Japanese Army soldiers who have been trapped there, but more notably, there's Imperial Japanese Navy guys who have been dismounted from their ships, who have taken the guns off ships, stuff like that, and have maintained the harbor, whatever. And so now they are going to basically sprinkle around Manila and defend it to the last man, contrary to what I guess their larger commander would have wanted. But I'm sure many of you know that the rivalry between the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy in World War II was incredibly intense, almost blood sport. So These guys are going to be penned into Manila, and they decide they're going to basically fight to the death. About 2/3 of them are Imperial Japanese Navy. They are not, by the way, Japanese Marines, as you'll often hear said colloquially in recollection of this. There was no Japanese Marine Corps as we would think of it as Americans. Okay, so then in the next slide, here's how this plays out. The fighting is done right there in the downtown by the harbor and all that, as 1st Cav and 37th ID fights this bitter urban battle against these stalwarts there. The fighting rages room to room, house to house, block to block. MacArthur is hoping to avoid using the main implements of our firepower, but of course, as we all know, once an urban battle gets going, if you want to have any survivability in that kind of environment, you got to use any firepower that you could possibly imagine, and that means destruction. Okay, so it's incredibly tragic. And this is a microcosm of what's happening in the Philippines. By coming back to liberate the Philippines, we now are going to have to destroy some of it and kill some of its people. That this is the tragedy of liberation. We've seen the same dynamic in France, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, portions of Italy, same kind of dilemma. Here we have it in Manila to a T. I mean, this major metropolitan area with hundreds of thousands of people now caught in the middle of this. And so as the Americans are fighting there, using all their firepower eventually, including airstrikes, but of course, it's the infantry that has to basically clear out building by building, block by block, carrying BARs, bazookas, satchel charges, grenades, submachine guns, and especially flamethrowers. The combat was intimate, bloody, it's horrifying. This is one recollection from Sergeant Warren Matha, the 5th Cavalry Regiment. He remembered it was like kick in the door, stick in the flamethrower nozzle, roast the Japanese alive. I can still hear them screaming. I can still smell the burning flesh. The Americans even sometimes poured gasoline into Japanese-controlled buildings and just roasted everyone inside. Even then, the infantry had to actually enter dugouts, caverns, pillboxes, just annihilate them to the last man. So that's what characterized a lot of this fighting. If we go to the next slide, you'd see a lot of images like this, just walking through slag heaps, various bulldozers there trying to clear rubble. But moving along in that dense urban environment. Onto the next one, which is, and these are not pleasant images, by the way, but walking past Japanese bodies. So Japanese bodies were lying everywhere. And so to guard against ambushers playing dead, U.S. soldiers basically just pump bullets into their head, into the head of nearly every corpse. And then a lot of times they would just stack them against walls, then sprinkle them with lime in order to in vain, to dampen their stench. You can imagine the smell that hung over the area. It was horrible. And maybe the worst aspect of the battle was the terrible destruction wrought on the people of Manila and the city landscape. The worst of the fighting, as I mentioned, happens in downtown. In one climactic barrage, the Americans utilized 370,000 pounds of ordnance, but you had to do it in order to have any force protection and survivability. That's the dilemma, right? So some Filipinos are getting caught in the firepower maw there by both sides, but the majority, many others, fell prey to a series of horrible, deliberate, savage Japanese atrocities. If we could go on to the next image. And so you're seeing a lot of this. The Japanese commander, Rear Admiral Iwabuchi, his headquarters issued orders to destroy everything: docks, warehouses, factories, people. On the pretext that Filipinos were aiding the Americans, he and other commanders sanctioned basically just killing them all, from infants to the very elderly. All people on the battlefield, with the exception of Japanese military personnel and Japanese civilians, will be put to death, declared one chilling order that I found in the archives. The order even included instructions on how to dispose of the bodies and advice on how to kill without using much ammo, because they wanted to use the ammo on the Americans. So the Japanese were stabbing people to death. They were putting them into buildings and burning them to death. Horrible. Some of them kept ghoulish tallies on how many people they killed, using guerrilla as a euphemism for anybody. One noted that he had stabbed 10 people to death and helped burn 150 others. Another sadly wrote, this is, I think, very poignant and troubling. He said, "The innocence I possessed at the time of leaving the homeland has long since disappeared. Now I'm a hardened sinner, and my sword is stained with blood. May God forgive me. May my mother forgive me." And I really think that it's worth deconstructing for a moment. This guy didn't come to the archipelago to be a perpetrator of atrocities. He's an everyday guy from Japan How has he been led into this? Because of this culture that you have, this culture of death and destruction, of dehumanization of the Filipinos, and anger that had been building among the Japanese, many of them, against the Filipinos for their pro-American attitudes, for the guerrillas, all that. The average Japanese soldier at the beginning of this war felt that he was fighting a morally right war against white-sponsored imperialism, European and American. That he was liberating fellow Asians. So if you came to the archipelago with that view, and then you saw that the Filipinos did not want you there, and they were killing some of your buddies, you can imagine where that could lead. So he and many thousands of others had really grown to hate the Filipinos as race traitors. And so that's partially what's leading to this. It's also troubling, too, in the sense that most of these guys know they're going to die in Manila, and yet they still perpetrate these atrocities. You know, you would think maybe they'd want to cleanse their souls somehow, but it was actually quite the opposite. So the Americans, did what they could. Look at the next image here. They do what they could to help the locals. There's a humanitarian operation, but of course we know it's a battlefield too, and that comes first. So you're doing both. The Army is doing both. The fighting finally peters out in early March. U.S. troops counted almost 17,000 Japanese dead. Tens of thousands of Manila residents were killed. We still don't know the precise number to this day. U.S. lost over 1,000 killed and 5,600 wounded. The city itself, here's what it looked like. If we go to the next slide, absolutely just destroyed. This is what you're looking at now. So think of the challenge now for engineers and medics too, by the way, but engineers to rebuild, obviously the city, but the harbor. The Japanese had shattered the harbor. Maybe the most famous harbor destruction in World War II, at least from a U.S. perspective, was the destruction of Cherbourg and Normandy in the summer of 1944. This made Cherbourg look like child's play. So U.S. Navy and Army engineers have to go in and absolutely rehab that place over these next several weeks and months in order to sustain swap operations. And they're going to do an amazing job. And not just to sustain operations, but for humanitarian too. You're taking care of the population as well. So you have that too. So the campaign in the Philippines wore on through the spring and summer of 1945. If we go to the next slide, it shows you the overall map. So 6th Army continues on Luzon, and you can see the locus of much of the fighting is north of Manila now, where Yamashita is holed up in the mountains there. But also I'd point out 8th Army under Eichelberger is going to be unleashed to clear much of the rest of the archipelago from the kind of middle to bottom part of our map there, and even off our map to the south and the west. So in 3 months, 8th Army secures pretty much every objective, most notably Cebu, Panay, most of Mindanao, big places. 8th carries out over 35 successful amphibious operations, liberates 7 million Filipinos, suffers about 2,000 dead and 7,000 wounded, kills untold numbers of Japanese military personnel. Once again, just like at Nasugbu, Eichelberger's forces just completely outwit, outfight, outthink, outmaneuver the enemy. And granted, of course, they've got a lot of advantages here in terms of air and sea power and guerrilla power too, helping them. But still, it's an absolute masterpiece of a campaign, and yet it's kind of strategically pointless, you could argue, because the point now is to continue to advance toward Japan itself. So why has MacArthur ordered this? He wants the whole Philippines liberated from the Japanese yoke. And so when Eichelberger pulls this off, this really lightning campaign over those several months, I mean, he really becomes the fair-haired boy at MacArthur's headquarters, and it's one of the reasons why he'll be earmarked for ultimately what would have been the main effort in Japan, what was called Operation Cornet in 1946, the invasion near Tokyo and whatnot. But from Eichelberger's standpoint, that sort of posterity, that immortality is elusive for him. So he does this brilliant performance, but most of us really don't know much about it. And even those of us who studied the Philippines, this is considered tertiary to what's going on Luzon. So what about that? Well, day by day, the soldiers continue their fighting there in the jungles, the mountains, the ravines, often ill-equipped, assisting on maybe a K ration or two per day. The conditions in which 6th Army soldiers fought were just appalling. Heat, insects, rain, mud, privation. troops struggling with disease, combat fatigue, usual battles of annihilation against the Japanese, and the violence of it all was just appalling. Um, uh, just a sort of microcosmic, one little example. 4 months on the front line, the 130th Infantry Regiment, 33rd Division, expended about 44,000 mortar shells, 6,400 105 millimeter self-propelled rounds, about 30,000 hand grenades, and about 1.4 million machine gun bullets. The regimental staff calculated the expenditure of, on average, 300 pounds of ordnance for every casualty inflicted on the Japanese. Think of all the shipping that took, and all the movement and transportation and planning and combined arms. It's just crazy. You know, that's the nature of this. If we go to the next slide, you can just, I want to show you these next two. It just gives you a little snapshot example of what this looked like. Okay, notice that the head of this image, there's a Filipino guerrilla probably acting as a guide for these American soldiers moving through that kind of terrain where the Japanese could be anywhere. The terrain is a big part of the challenge. And on to the next one, it shows you also what you're dealing with here in terms of this, the ridges and mountains and endless jungles and caves and all this kind of stuff. That's the operational environment. And it's definitely an infantryman's fight. They suffered about 90% of the casualties. So in the course of the campaign, Kruger reported about 38,000 battle casualties, including over 8,100 killed and 157 MIA. But I would say that's kind of disingenuous because over that 6-month period, his army actually lost 93,400 men to supposed non-battle casualties, disease, and that meant like malaria, yellow fever, dysentery, things you got from operating in the mountains, in combat. And of course, some of those guys are combat fatigue, and that's very much related to battle too. So that terrible attrition is very similar to what Eisenhower dealt with in the fall of 1944, the Argonne Forest in World War I, Grant's Overland Campaign. So yeah, I mean, Yamashita, of course, will famously just resist all the way to the end of the war. If we go to the next image here, we see the sort of dissolution of the Japanese Empire, but where it is by the time the war ends in August 1945. Again, I'll point out, Yamashita does not surrender until after the formal surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri on September 2nd, 1945. So he believes he has satisfied honor. And of course, this has been a headache for MacArthur to have to deal with this resistance all the way to that time. So by that time, of course, too, one look at that map shows you where the Japanese are by the end of the war, and this enormous repatriation effort that you now have. So it's a huge job for Allied military authorities and the Japanese government once the surrender has happened. And then in 1946, some 3.2 million military personnel and about 2.8 million civilians had surrendered and in most instances been repatriated back to Japan. From little islands in the South Pacific that have been bypassed to portions of the Philippines to what was the Dutch East Indies, what is now Indonesia, China, Korea, Vietnam. I mean, you name it. Okay, so the war had come to an end, but of course the American victory comes at a fearful cost. About 111,000 Americans were killed or went missing in the war against Japan. As I mentioned, the plurality of those deaths were Army ground soldiers. Those whose remains had been recovered were scattered among 133 cemeteries all over the Pacific and Asia. There were 9 in China. There were 55 in Burma and India. How did they do that? Well, overworked graves registration teams had buried them as carefully and respectfully as possible, and it was just a horrible, thankless job. Some stared wide-eyed, one graves registration soldier recalled. Others had died in the middle of a scream and their mouths hung open. Others had no face at all. The work was nightmarish, and it ate at our hearts. So in May 1946, Congress passed a law creating the Return of the World War II Dead program. So that was an attempt to recover and repatriate as many dead as possible. And I would say that the very existence of this program epitomized the country's wealth, the ability to do this, its security, its victory in the war, but also its Republican, small r, commitment to the value of the lives of its citizens, that this was supposed to matter. It also reflected American values about the importance of recovering corporeal remains as a kind of tangible commemorative symbol of the mourn and a way for closure, for loved ones. So next of kin made the decision whether to return the remains of their loved ones or leave them in place at an American Battle Monuments Commission run cemetery somewhere around the globe. So you can imagine, too, that probably led to some pretty difficult conversations. Who's the key decision maker? Family members disagreeing as to whether the remains ought to be brought home or not. Difficult dysfunctional circumstances where family members were hard to reach. I mean, whatever. So what you would do as the next of kin, you would have to fill out Army Quartermaster Form 345, and you'd have to tell the government what you wanted done. About 61% chose to have them returned. So in the next slide, just as the Army had done so much of the fighting all over the globe, it now took the lead in carrying out this program. So there's about 13,000 soldiers involved in this program. Guys like these, and the recovery team spread far and wide, literally to the ends of the earth, sometimes in very dangerous places, to recover the dead from small graves like you see here, or in the next slide, temporary cemeteries that Graves Registration set up in all sorts of places all over the globe. You can imagine how exacting and ghoulish this job could be for these teams. So it's very similar to the way the Americans fought the war. They're going to expend huge amounts of equipment and material. Crews sprayed a powdery hardening compound into body cavities to minimize stench and fluid leakage. There were 2 to 5 pounds of compound per body. 1 gallon of deodorant spray per 20 bodies. 1 pair of gloves used for every 3 to 5 bodies, according to the Army's records. By late summer 1947, they had recovered and processed 72,252 remains in the Pacific and Asia. About 30,000 of these were processed in Manila, about 3,500 in Calcutta, over 23,000 on Saipan. And by the way, they hadn't all died on Saipan. They had been collected in island, in the Marianas and elsewhere and put in Saipan. About 2,000 in Yokohama, and those were mainly POWs who had died in Japanese captivity or aviators who had died in missions over Japan. In the next slide, at last, on September 30th, 1947, the first set of 3,027 remains were ready for return aboard this ship, U.S. Army transport, Honda Knot. That was a 4,000-ton Liberty ship. There were 10 other Army funeral ships that would follow in the wake of Honda Knot. The crew of Honda Knot had meticulously cleaned the ship, lathered it with a fresh coat of paint for these very distinguished guests. And the remains are now ensconced in steel caskets. So 10 days later, on October 10th, in the image you're seeing here, Honda Knot majestically glided under the Golden Gate Bridge in the San Francisco area into the bay. A cannon boomed in the distance, and the ship dropped anchor opposite Marina Green, where hundreds of people had gathered for a somber memorial service. The group included the mayor, the secretary of the Navy, and General Mark Clark. Port crews then unloaded the flag-draped caskets, loaded them on especially fitted rail cars for transportation to their various destinations. At that point, telegrams were then sent to the next of kin, informing them of the imminent arrival of their loved one. Each casket was escorted by a specially trained servicemen of equal or higher rank to the deceased. These weren't just people plucked from anywhere. They were specially trained. And they are basically operating as the face of the government here and dealing with the families and everything that means. Consummating warm friendships, dealing with the anguish of grief sometimes. I mean, you name it. They've got to be very well trained and very professional. They're not drinking while they're doing this, as you can imagine. It's very strict. The Army had established 15 major distribution centers around the country that read like a travelogue of America: San Francisco, Mira Loma, California, San Antonio, Fort Worth, Kansas City, Columbus, Ohio, Philadelphia, New York City, and Charlotte, North Carolina, to name just a few. The next slide, before groups large and small, major cities, mid-sized towns, remote outposts alike. The caskets were ceremoniously buried with full military honors wherever the next of kin chose, at a price of $564.50 per funeral. 78% were buried in a private cemetery or a family plot. The rest in like what you see here, at a national military cemetery. Among those now interred in their home soil were many, many thousands of Army soldiers from every corner of the Pacific Asia War. I'll just give you a few, and I'll close out with this. Private James Henson of the 192nd Tank Battalion, who had died of beriberi as a POW after being captured in the Philippines in 1942. Sergeant Frank Simmons, who had died in the South Pacific of pneumonia. Of all things, you could die of disease, too, just like in past wars. PFC Norman Petschauer, who was killed in action with the 27th Infantry Division on Saipan in the summer of 1944. PFC Louis Profeta had once been captain of his high school football team. He was killed in action at Buna in New Guinea. That was, by the way, the first American ground victory in World War II, won by General Eichelberger in early January 1943. Sergeant John Zangerly, the 37th Infantry Division, killed in action in the ferocious fighting in Manila in 1945. And Lieutenant Buford Cooper, killed in a vehicle accident in Burma on the Stilwell Road, the supply road from from India through Burma and into China. Just killed in a vehicle accident, as you could be anywhere. And PSC Monroe Hicks of Sikeston, Missouri, whose hometown paper referred to him as both a returning hero and, quote, a colored soldier, in a kind of emblem of the time. In 1951, after 4 years and shipment home of over 171,000 Americans from all over planet Earth, and the expenditure of nearly $164 million, the return of the World War II dead repatriation program officially ended. But I would say that the mourning never really did. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our Writing Awards series. If you like this episode, please click like and subscribe. You can also find more Army history and support the Foundation at our website at www.armyhistory.org. Thank you.